Who is Jordan Peterson? Well, that depends on who you ask. He gets a lot of love and he gets a lot of hate, and he's kind of easy to make fun of, but he's also incredibly insightful. Today we're going to be doing an analysis of some of his influences and key ideas. I have compiled these after watching hundreds of hours of his podcasts and conversations. One of the key takeaways from one of the old Egyptian stories is the idea of resurrecting the father. If there's an old decaying structure, if there's an old king and they're losing some of their perspicacity, the idea is that the new youthful force comes in and adds to it. It lends the old king one of its young eyes. So that was one of the ideas that I think Peterson touched on and really liked. I think it's also where Peterson got the idea of order and chaos from. The Mesopotamian creation myth largely centered on the battle between order and chaos, and they were represented by two different figures, one of them being Marduk and the other being Tiamat. And I'm not going to go into the whole story now, but it's that the world is locked in a battle between order and chaos. I think that's, a central idea of his, and I think that's where he got that, idea from. Then I want to go into the Bible. He also loved the Adam and Eve story, so I just wanted to read that paragraph of the story. The snake was sneakier than any of the other wild animals that the Lord God had made. One day it came to the woman, Eve, and asked, "Did God tell you not to eat from the fruit of any tree in the garden?" The woman answered, "God said we could eat fruit from any tree in the garden except the one in the middle. He told us not to eat fruit from that tree or even touch it. If we do, we will die." "No, you won't," the snake replied. "God understands what will happen on that day when you eat the fruit. You will see what you have done, and you will know the difference between right and wrong, just as God does." The woman stared at the fruit. It looked beautiful and tasty. She wanted the wisdom it would give her, and she ate some of the fruit. Her husband was there with her, so she gave him some of the fruit too. And once they saw what they had done, they realized that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together, and they covered themselves. So Peterson loved the story for a few reasons. One being that he read another book by Lynn Isbell, and it spoke about biological and literal senses in which fruit and snakes played a role in human vision evolution. So Isabel makes the case that snake detection and the ability to discern the ripeness of colored fruits was a learned evolutionary trait that rapidly advanced the human vision ability. So while the Bible was potentially mostly figurative, this is an aspect where he saw that there was an extremely literal interpretation. Peterson was also heavily influenced by the psychologists that came before him, including Alfred Adler, Carl Rogers, Jung, and then less so strictly psychologists, more literary figures and philosophers, I guess, were Nietzsche and Dostoevsky. Adler thought about the idea of striving for superiority, which is going to be a recurring theme amongst these psychologists. The idea of self-conquering and continual learning and becoming a better version of yourself. This is a fundamental aspect of Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. It's the idea of becoming a better person, and that's basically the key to solving all your problems. He also respected Piaget for his work on the idea of that children play and act out rules to games before they can, say exactly what the rules are. And this idea of there being play circuitry in the brain, and there being experiments done on rats that show play circuitry. And so I think that you could kind of construe life as a sort of kind of twisted, super complex game. I think that was an idea that he found very interesting. Jung is obviously an extremely important, inspiration in Peterson's life. The idea of individuation is just one of many really important ideas that Jung kind of established and brought forth. The idea of individuation is that you have many different distinct parts of your psyche, and that it is your job as a growing human being to understand these pieces and incorporate them into a unified whole. So the pieces are the persona, the animus, the anima, the ego, and the shadow. And basically, when you merge all those pieces, it's called the process of individuation, and they become the capital S self. Nietzsche was also an influence on Peterson. I think Jordan really liked his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. It's the idea of a man living up in the mountains for a while, basically learning the secrets of the universe, coming down to reality and kind of being ill-received. I think that idea of, meeting the world where it is one that Peterson finds interesting and one that I really like. He also has some great one-liners about Nietzsche, calling him full of himself, but also, a huge figure, like a really titanic force and years ahead of his time. All of those praise, but also kind of, a slashing effect where he's writing where he's incredible, but says he's incredible. So it's just an interesting dichotomy where there's arrogance, but also brilliance. Also, the Nietzschean idea of an Übermensch, the Superman, is the idea of this next generation person that, defines their own values and lives in perfect accordance with them, and basically is just like the most astute person that is, conquers themselves and is extremely disciplined and all these wonderful things. And that's kind of like a much more extreme version of what Peterson talks about a lot, which is, setting a proper moral framework and value hierarchy, understanding, what you really care about, and then living in accordance with that framework. And then lastly, I want to talk about Dostoevsky, who has been a huge influence in my life, partially thanks to Peterson. He is just the most incredible author. One line that I thought was funny is when Peterson called Nietzsche a character in a Dostoevsky novel. I just thought that was so funny. You can dive into differing psychologies and then allow that to unfold over time in narrative structure. I think Peterson really admired Dostoevsky's ability to do that in like the most complex but also succinct and sophisticated way, and have them all interplay and all add to each other. And it's also kind of could be interpreted as each character in a Dostoevsky novel is so distinct, they could almost be representing different aspects of the psyche. So it's in the way that they all come together and, have dialogue with each other that is the same as Jung's idea of individuation and the different aspects of your psyche all coming together and adding to each other. There's obviously a lot more to say about Jordan Peterson, but I think that's a good introduction to some of his influences and main ideas. The early creation myths, the biblical stories, and the psychologists. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great weekend.